then. Okay, well, welcome to the Four Corners speaker sessions for our second segment of what we're calling Hometown Conversations. I'm your host, Ken Duff. I've been working with Four Corners, coordinating the live music sessions since March of 2020, and I'm pleased to have been asked to host these conversations. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with a regular contributor to the speaker sessions, Joe Graham. But instead of his usual subject matter, which is the history of the area, we'll be getting to know and learn a little bit about the history of Joe Graham. So this is all about Joe. You're going to learn things you don't know about him, but he's free to hold back any spy information that he happens to have in his possession. So welcome to Joe.
Well, thank you very much. I have to just observe, though, if Jack Berger were around, he would be saying, "Well, you did a very good job of that because you acknowledged that it's the hometown." And he said, if all of the English people in the Laurentians were put into one town, it would be the second biggest town.
Well, there you are. Just one thing for all of our guests who have tuned in today. We're going to hold all of the questions off until the end of the session. We have a number of points that we want to make through the next 45 minutes or so with Joe. So if you have any questions that pop as a result of any of the information that you hear, just jot them down as a note. And when we've gotten through our little list that Joe and I have agreed upon, we'll open it up for you to ask any of the questions that you might feel pertinent. So we're going to start this session by first of all, Joe, asking you, who's Joe Graham? Where were you born? Where were you raised?
I was born, my family was living in Pointe Claire at the time, and I was born at St. Mary's Hospital in Montreal. And I happen to know, isn't that something? And I grew up in Montreal until I was 10, and then we moved to the Laurentians. Mm-hmm. That was a big incident in our lives because my father died and my mother had two houses. And she had been an avid skier, and she had to make a living because my father was quite young and he didn't have proper insurance. So she thought she would do a better job of making a living in ski country than in the city.
Oh, great. What about your education background? You want to give us a little bit of information of how you became so learned?
I'm still learning.
Learned.
I'm not there yet.
Yeah. Okay.
I did some voice practice this morning. I hope I had to make a recording for something else, and I hope I didn't wreck my voice. Thought I used it all up. My education, well, to start with, in the younger years, I had a Protestant and a Catholic mother and father, so they were sort of arguing over which schools we should go to, and I got shifted around quite a lot between Catholic and Protestant schools. So I got a very interesting perspective starting right there about Protestant and Catholic culture. And the end of my high school, I met, as so many people do in their lives, their most important teacher. And my most important teacher was a teacher at the St. Agathe High School whose subjects were English composition, literature, and history. And what made him important was that he was never trained as a teacher. He was trained as a university professor. And he had a problem at McGill. He seems to have had, I mean, it's a long time ago, but he seems to have had a drinking problem, and they ousted him. So a good friend of his gave him a job in St. Agathe High School. This man was quite elderly by the time I had him as a teacher. And he had the most fascinating nervousness. He could not speak to people one-on-one. He could speak to the class, but he would not speak to the class unless he had complete silence in the class, and he wouldn't ask for that silence. He would wait patiently for it with a big smile pasted on his face. We learned that the smile was actually pretty scary. And once everything had quietened down, he would look over his bifocals around the room, and then he would look down at the book that he would always be holding and begin to read. And he had an incredible voice. He would just make the book he was reading live. and we would be mesmerized till the end of the class. And then when the bell rang, he would say, finish to the end of the chapter for next time. Well, I don't think we waited to next time for the end of the chapter. And he didn't give us any kind of direction other than to say that you have to get a composition of one of these 5 subjects in, and he gave 5 different subjects every week, right through the year. And if you don't get every single one in, you won't pass. You have to get them all in, even if you fail them. If you don't get them in, you won't pass. End of the story. And he taught history the same way. He made everything just live. So when I got to the end of that environment, I realized the only thing that I hadn't really learned anything about and that I should have learned was French. For some reason, I just could not learn French. And I think it was because the English people in that school who spoke French did so very well because they lived in St. Agatha and had grown up there. I had grown up in a more of a removed environment, and I never had the exposure to French. So I couldn't keep up with the French class. And at the end of high school, I realized I had to get French. So I worked all summer, saved up my money, grabbed my guitar in my knapsack and went to Paris, one-way ticket, with a quick deal with my uncle that if I got into trouble, he would help me out. Well, it wasn't long before I got into trouble and he helped me out. What I did is I sat in on classes at the university and I took a course on learning French. And I got to know people, and most of the people I got to know were what I called the guilty conscience of the bourgeoisie. They were bourgeois people who saw themselves as communist and wanting to make a new world. And so it was quite an education. And I actually came back to North America intent on joining the Chicago Communist Party, only to realize that when I got to New York with the person who was encouraging me to do so, that I couldn't handle New York. It was just absolutely terrifying. And he said, Chicago's worse. So I went back to Montreal. One of the things that I'm not mentioning is that was a time when many of us, and I was no exception, were experimenting with all kinds of things. And so I was pretty screwed up by the time I came home. I have to acknowledge that. And I took a plane to Montreal, and after I got off the plane, I got my suitcase and discovered that they had crushed my guitar. I took a bus up to the Laurentians. My guitar I'd pay $15 for, so I didn't know what to do. Got up to the Laurentians and then I hitchhiked home. And I had been told by these communist sympathizers that I had gotten to know quite well, if I was going back to Quebec, I should join the FLQ. That would be the best thing I could do for the movement. I said, well, that's interesting. Anyway, I got picked up by a very nice elderly man with his son in a big, beautiful American car. They didn't speak any English. They looked sort of like they were farmers, right to the bands over their, what do you call it? The suspenders. And they let me sit in the back seat. And they sort of were, I could see the concern in their face that the back seat might have to be cleaned afterwards. I had quite long hair. I wasn't very kempt at all. And they were very nice to me and they brought me where I wanted to go. And I was thinking, sitting in the back seat of this luxurious American car with these two clearly very comfortable people in the front, I'm supposed to convince them to quit everything they're doing and join a movement that will cause them all kinds of difficulties. This doesn't sound very reasonable. So I started looking around at my options and realized that was not going to be one of them. I got home and started over, basically.
Would have been a major difference in culture and everything, having grown up in the Laurentians and then ending up in Chicago.
Yeah. Well, Paris was my first city as a result,
Sure.
because I went to Paris and I knew it better than I knew Montreal. But Paris is a very human scale city. And it was a wonderful experience there. I moved to Montreal to go to school, to try to get an education. I wasn't very successful at it because I was still quite stunned, if you want, sort of overwhelmed by the life that I had had. And I got accepted at in philosophy at the University of Moncton. And I got convinced out of going by members of my family who said, you know, philosophy is a waste of time. If you want to make a living, you have to get real work, and you would be wasting your life doing something like that. And one of the examples was really funny. I was told that, you know, if you look around at the people who can afford to drive a Mercedes-Benz, 9 out of 10 of them never went to university. I thought, interesting factoid. I wasn't really interested in driving a Mercedes-Benz. In fact, when I got back from my travels, my younger brother came to me at one point and said, he was 3 years younger, more than 3 years younger than me. He said, Joe, Mom won't let me get my driver's license until you do. So I wasn't going to drive a fancy car anytime soon. So I went out and got my license so that he could.
Good thing. So from your education and your travel, that had to have led into some form of work life, and can you maybe talk a little bit about the kind of work experiences you had, unless of course you were a spy, so we know you're not allowed to talk about that, but some of the work experiences that you've had that have gotten you to this point in your life.
Okay, well, I'll just interject the last little bit of my education is I took some very advanced math courses, which I figured would therefore lead to a living. And I was really quite good at them. I learned all of the math that was not available in high school. And then I got to the end of them. And I said to the teacher, what do you do with this stuff? He says, nothing, it's all theoretical. So I went and got a job. My older brother had helped me get a job in greenhouses where he worked. And I loved plants. I've been growing plants since I was in my early teens. I loved them, so I loved the greenhouse experience. And then when I was in Montreal and looking for a job, I went and knocked on the door of a bunch of greenhouses in LaSalle, and they engaged me and I had a wonderful time there working there. And eventually I moved back to the Laurentians, where I created a little business doing gardening, moved into a tiny house that I had built when I was in my teens. By this time, I had spent some years in Montreal, and the little house was a square log house, 10 feet by 11 feet, off in the woods, with no road and no electricity, no plumbing. So I would tramp in through the snow to get there, and in the summer, I had a car. I would drive around and do gardening, and I had a little gardening business that lasted a number of years, until I was invited by an uncle to go to the Eastern Townships and take over his farm. He wanted a partner on his farm. Now, this was not a farm in the sense that you might be thinking. This was a gentleman's farm, and he was to be the gentleman and I was to be the farmer. But being a rather naive kid, I didn't get that right away. So it lasted for a few years. I met Sheila there. We had our first son. We got married. We had our first son. And we decided that if we really wanted to farm, we had to be farming on our own, not for somebody else. So we left the farm, moved to St. Lucie, went to the property where the little house was, decided to build a big house, sell it, and move to Nova Scotia and become farmers. We haven't done the last part yet.
It's still on the to-do list, is it?
That's right. It's still on the to-do list. Sheila flew off to Istanbul to see her family. A lot of Sheila's family is from Istanbul, and she took our older son with her when he was a year and a half old. And I decided this was a good time for me to find a job, a really good job. And I did find a job. I also renovated the kitchen, which shocked Sheila. Her jaw dropped when she saw it, and I realized that it wasn't working. 1/4-inch plywood, unpainted cabinets didn't really fit with her picture of a nice kitchen. And Sheila's quite a cook, so that was a failure. And I figured I should look for a different kind of job. And I found a job because we wanted to know how well we had built our new house, which we had built but hadn't sold. And I found an expert company from Western Canada who did infrarouge heat scans. So I contacted the salesman and asked him if he would show me how these things worked. He said, sure thing. He drove out to from Toronto to show me this thing. And he showed it to me, and I could see what the R value was in the wall. The way he was doing it, I could see what the cold spots were. I could see how inefficient the house was. And this guy was, it was absolutely ridiculous for him to be sent out from Toronto to show an unqualified buyer an $11,000 electronic instrument. I mean, there's no way I could have bought it. They should have known that. They shouldn't have sent him out. But I thought, well, maybe these things could be sold in Quebec. And this guy didn't speak any French, and he didn't really know anything about Quebec. So sometime later, I contacted his boss out west and said, "Do you want someone to sell in Quebec?" He said, "Sure, I love that. I've been thinking the same thing. I'm going to fly out to meet you." But really easy going. He did. I discovered that he was fascinated with the quality of restaurants in Montreal. Wow, a tablecloth. This kind of level of excitement was charming. He was an engineer who had developed some of these things. He had picked up this particular product from used aircraft products, and he was still developing other things. And I started working for him, and I went to all the pulp mills. I ended up doing more scans of the scans, that were paid for. Like I created a whole business of doing heat scans for the pulp and paper industry, examining their electrical systems, all kinds of things like this, and charging them for it. And that, because these things were way too expensive, no one was going to buy them. And then my boss contacted me and said, "Joe, we're changing lines." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "We're going into forensic studies. I'm sending you the new equipment." Well, I decided to get off the train. I had been taking a real estate sales course, figuring my mother did that finally as a way of supporting us, and I should be able to do it as well. And so I followed that route instead. I just couldn't see learning a new technology with this wonderful guy who completely changed the rules on me as soon as I started getting somewhere.
So then you moved into a career in real estate up in the Laurentians.
Yes, and one of the first things we learned, or I learned, was that I had to go to St. Adele for this, and I lived, east of St. Agathe, and the properties that I knew about were up here. And I realized two things. One is that the market that I could work was the market where people were coming up to have country homes, and that the country homes were very far from St. Adele. And I began very innocently taking people up to these places and trying to do this. I stayed away from first residence homes because that's where everyone was working. So I thought I had to find myself a sort of a niche. It was a good idea, but what happened most of the time is I would get back to St. Adele with the clients, and they would say, "It's really nice, but it's so far." And that would be it. So I figured I had to figure out, and this was the big change that came in my life. I'd always loved history. When I was a teenager in school, I began reading history. That was my passion. And I just read and read history. So I decided that maybe I could do some history and share with these potential clients what the history of what they were driving through to get to these houses that were so far from St. Adele. So I studied all of the neighborhoods. I learned all the background stories. I was fascinated by it, and I began to share them with them as we drove out to these houses. And I began to sell houses. This was magical. People loved it. I would tell all these stories all the way out and all the way back. But when we got to the house, I would open the door and shut up. I didn't understand houses. I didn't understand how to sell houses. I believed that the houses would have to do that by themselves. And it worked. And then Sheila and I decided maybe we should open up in St. Agathe. So she did the same thing as me, and we opened up in St. Agathe with our own company and continued to tell stories. So my career in real estate, I always saw more as a career of storytelling than of sales. I mean, I would come back from houses and she would say, "Well, tell me some of the stuff about the house so I can make the property description." I couldn't remember.
Important stuff like how many rooms and
that kind of thing. What was the floor? I think it's wood.
Well, they say that I mean, you're not the first one to identify that one of the most important part of the whole job of selling is, in fact, being able to tell the story, whether it's about the product or how it's used or whatever. So you certainly learned that in good time. So I'd like to talk a little bit now, and I'm sure many of the people who are joined us are already aware of some of it, but about your current lifestyle and your gardens and your self-sustaining lifestyle.
Well, as I mentioned, I love growing things from when I was young. My two passions have always been gardens and history. So Sheila and I felt that we could grow food to our specs, to give us satisfaction with what we had. And with our business, we started a garden. When we finished building the house, we put asparagus in, and that asparagus planted in '79 is still producing. And we spread over a huge area with the garden now. And we just thawed out one of the freezers a couple of days ago, and Sheila was very upset at how many vegetables we have that cannot be shared because they'll thaw out too fast, and that we might not be capable of eating in one winter. So the gardens went very well. At first they didn't, we would put all kinds of different crops in, and if two came up, we were happy. But over time we got better and better at it. We kept chickens and we built soil, and now we have like really successful gardens. We're delighted with them. And they still give me the same satisfaction as they did when I started growing potatoes at 15 or 14 years old.
Yeah. I remember when I was growing up, I think you and I discussed, I grew up in Dumontagne, and I remember people used to talk about the farms in the Laurentians were basically pretty much all of them started out as rock farms. Until they were cultivated by people like yourself.
One of the interesting aspects that I found studying history was that as I began studying the deeds of these properties to figure out, how they were first created, who did it, and so on. And one of the things I found fascinating was between when the train came in and 1915 or 16, maybe the end of the war, even somewhere in there, most of the farms were sold to Montrealers. And in very many of the cases, when the farmer sold his farm, the one thing that he would not accept to give up was his compost. He would literally take the compost to his new home. And there were some beautiful vegetable gardens, even when I was younger in St. Agathe, just beautiful. And they could not imagine not having that compost.
Sure.
Now, if you think about it, at that time, there was no chemical fertilizers would not have been a factor in the early part of the 1900s. And even the money economy that we know today was only just beginning. It hadn't penetrated to places in the country. Loans and this kind of stuff were being worked out. How the whole banking system worked was still being worked out in the 1890s and early 1900s.
Right. Yeah, I guess the other side of it too is from a real practical perspective, any farmer who's got himself a nice compost set up has invested lots of time and lots of energy in getting it to that stage. So leaving it behind had to have been a really tearing possibility.
Well, it's interesting to me that the farmers in the Eastern Townships, whom we got to know and loved, one of their principal rule was you never sell your compost or your soil, ever. That's principal rule. You just don't do it.
Yeah.
And so I guess that's part of it too. And
Yeah.
that was even in the Eastern Townships where the soil is lush compared to here.
Yeah, I live in my house is surrounded on three sides by cornfields, and I marvel at it's a fairly big farm operation, and I marvel at the day-to-day activity, whether it's spreading manure or just keeping the soil as rich as it could possibly be, and you wonder, are you ever going to plant anything? They seem to spend so much of their time just covering the fields, and so it's obviously a major investment, and as I say, in both time and energy. So
the soil is your profit in farming.
Yeah, that's right.
There's no other.
So
the story in the townships was the two farmers leaning over the fence talking together. And Doug says to George, "So George, what would you do if you won the lottery?" He rubs his chin, thinks for a while, says, "I don't know, Doug. I guess I would just keep farming till it's all gone."
Yes, that's right. That's right. So just going back to your, I mean, a lot of your current activity runs around the history of the area, and we're going to get to an important part of that. But just where do you think you talk about how one of your passions is history? Where do you think that passion comes from?
It comes. I don't want to get into it too much because it might sound rather overwhelming, but it comes from the fact that at a certain point, I realized that I was no longer capable of being a Catholic or believing in God. And I don't know when it happened. It happened one night, and the next morning it was gone. And before that, I had been very, very religious. I even thought I was going to be a priest, and then suddenly it was gone. I was 16 years old, and I went through a difficult period where I couldn't even sleep. I was trying to figure it out. I just didn't know what had hit me. I began to read, and what I began to read was history. And the history took me there to realizing that I had to know where all this came from, why we had these beliefs, and so on. And also, when I was doing the research up here on stories to tell the clients, I kept getting to this sort of far enough back that there was suddenly a new title created. And I felt that that wasn't the beginning. That was just a new beginning. There had to have been something here before. And so I was exploring simultaneously what happened here before the indigenous culture and what happened in Catholicism and religion, to bring me to be seeing these two in my own environment, my own background in the Laurentians.
Mm-hmm. So that brings us to a point that I certainly didn't want to overlook. You've just released a book based on a lot of the work that you've been doing in these studies of the history, and I think maybe you could share a little bit of your thoughts and information about the book that you've released.
Yeah, I imagine a number of people with us today have read it, and if they have thoughts, I'd love to hear them. But my feeling with that book was that I wanted to figure out what happened, what caused these Europeans to come here, how they were perceived, and so on. And I realized that it was all an outgrowth or a reaction to the breakdown of the Catholic Church in Europe. Now, when you say the Catholic Church, people will say, well, that's just all religion, but it's not. Religion is a very small part of any religion, sadly enough. What religions was social organizations. They looked after health, social services, registries of births and deaths, marriages, education. That's a heck of a mandate. And if you compare that mandate to a provincial government, it's probably 50% or more of the provincial government's budget today. So there was a huge amount of money in these things. And the dominant owner of that sector of the economy in Europe was the Catholic Church. And so when the Protestant churches began to form what we call the reformist period, they were fighting for that monopoly to be broken. And the problem is that the kings really, really valued that monopoly because it kept control of the people. In fact, the church controlled the way people thought for so long, for 1,000 years before that, that even the family units that we understand were created by the church's decision on how they wanted society to be organized so they could control it for the king. Mm-hmm. So when they came here, there was a totally different world that they couldn't even recognize, and they didn't recognize. And that world was two functioning civilizations, one that came out of Mexico and one that was in South America. And those two functioning civilizations were two of the 3 or 4 that ever developed in the world. They were fascinating, and they were very, very different from Europe because they didn't have the fundamental difference was they didn't have herding animals. It sounds simplistic, but this was all the kinds of things that fascinated me and drove me to put it into a book.
It's interesting, your reference to the Catholic Church looking to control basically how civil society evolved. I have a friend who was telling me a story about she grew up in the Sudbury, Northern Ontario area, and she told me a story that was told to her by her mother that came down from her grandmother, on how every 4 years the local parish priest would come knocking on the door to remind her that it was time to have another child. And so, and they were quite serious about it. And there were threats of excommunication and not allowing them to attend, or all the rest of it, because the only way to keep the Catholic Church alive was to keep having children and bringing them up in the Catholic faith. So it's not all that much of a long-term, long ago history that those kinds of ideas and thoughts existed.
No.
So what do you see looking in your crystal ball, Joe, going forward? What do you see grasping and holding your attention beyond what you're doing at the present time?
Well, right now I'm just overwhelmed by. I feel I've been working so intensely on this book that I feel a little bit like Rip Van Winkle coming out from under it and looking at the world and realizing that I've sort of lost my place. The social media is a big factor, but also COVID has caused all kinds of slippages that are really hard to comprehend. I think that we are overdue for something like COVID, and that I think it's just a gentle nudge compared to what might be coming. I'm looking at it and saying, what can I do to prepare myself and those I love for what's coming? Because I think we are heading down a very slippery slope. I don't know what to do. I don't think any of us do, but I think a good place to start is to listen to the people who have been advising us for 500 years. Because if you look back at the indigenous people in North America, they have been telling us that we have to change our ways, quite literally, for 500 years. I have one speech that I quoted in the book where Canasatago, the head of the Five Nations at that point, is telling the governor of Maryland that the Europeans have to accept his people as their elder sibling and listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't. The Europeans arriving in North America, Central America, and so on, arrived with a violent arrogance, whereas the people who received them were receiving them out of friendship and out of an ethic of sharing that was a fundamental part of the culture. They had to share. You did not share. So there was no conquering of the Americas. There was just this incomprehension on the two sides of each other.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a good time. I'm like watching the clock here. It's a good time to throw the floor open to our guests and see if any of them have any questions for you. I see Chloe's back on screen there, and I'm going to let Chloe manage the process because she's far more familiar with running this Zoom machine than I am. So if anyone has any questions or any comments that they'd like to make to Joe, please, I guess it's a raise your hand kind of thing. Is it, Chloe?
Well, I think Ken has unmuted, so he has a question. I'll take that. But if you could raise your hand, if there's more than one person, that would be great. So I'll let it up to you, Ken, if you have a question.
Yeah, Joe, I read your book with great interest. The title of the book is Insatiable Greed, and it talks about essentially the greed of the ruling classes at the time, which were the church and the various royal families and rich businessmen, for anything they could find in North America. And you described the impact on the indigenous people, which was absolutely horrific. But insatiable greed, I'm wondering, based on the comments that you made just towards the end of your talk, I don't think it's a temporary phenomenon. And I think what you may be suggesting is that insatiable greed is carrying on, and we may yet pay a price for it. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Okay, well, I am fascinated to see that you remember the name of it as insatiable greed, because effectively that's what it's saying, but it's insatiable hunger.
Right.
The actual name of it, which has gotten me into a lot of trouble because people think it's a cookbook of some kind. And maybe your suggestion would have been better. I think that part of the problem that we are faced with can be seen in our concept of property. We have this obsession for property, and that's been the problem that we have had for a very long time. And I think it grows as much out of the
Lost.
Joe just froze.
Yeah.
Just give him a second. Sometimes it unfreezes. When the weather's not super good, the internet up there isn't the best. So I'm hoping it's going to fix itself.
We may have to chase him off to his iPhone.
Yeah, he has a backup plan, so. I will give him a call just to make sure he didn't not notice.
Sure. Oh, he's gone now.
Which means he's noticed, and I will give him a second to see if he
Sure.
can reconnect.
So if I remove spotlight here, Chloe, they don't have to look at my fat face for the rest of the broadcast.
And I'm on, which we already have the interview on, so that we don't see anybody else.
Okay.